Good morning, everyone. I'm Debbie McNeil, Acting President of the League of Women Voters, Edina. We're very pleased this morning to be presenting the program Money in Politics with our featured speaker, Sherry Knuth of the League of Women Voters, Minnesota. Sherry is the Public Policy and Outreach Manager for the State League. She focuses on voting rights, campaign finance, and protecting judicial independence. She lobbies at the Minnesota State Capitol on behalf of the State League and conducts educational programs like this one today and outreach to the public. She was a leader in the successful defeat of the proposed Minnesota amendment, which would have required a photo ID of every voter and would have restricted election day registration. She has a master's degree from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs and a law degree from the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. In 2014, she received a very well-deserved Hubert H. Humphrey Public Leadership Award for her efforts to promote citizen participation in the electoral process. Please join me now in welcoming Sherry Knuth.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. And especially thank you for taking a beautiful autumn morning to be listening to an important topic, but nonetheless it's inside, so I know you made a little sacrifice to be here. Despite Minnesota's strong culture of civic engagement, the systems that fuel our basic democracy are at risk today in Minnesota and in the United States at large. Over the past 5 years ago, we've seen some real impacts on some of our basic democratic tenets. Some of the most pernicious attacks come from attempts to suppress the vote, which Debbie mentioned in her introduction, and from the impact of money in politics. The influx of special interest money into electoral campaigns in the wake of Citizens United has threatened leaders' responsiveness to citizens. And the increase of that influence that large donors have on our elected officials is a more significant problem in the wake of the federal McCutcheon decision decided a few months ago. These are challenging problems, but already I believe that we're seeing citizens and non-governmental organizations and some of our elected leaders beginning to step up to the challenges that we have. Today, I'm going to talk about the Minnesota campaign finance system with reference to the impact of recent federal court decisions. I'll also talk about recommendations of the League of Women Voters and what we as citizens can do right now to start the process of reform and improvement around these issues. League of Women Voters of the United States has been a leader at the federal level in issues around money in politics. Our overall position is to support incremental improvements while in the longer term supporting public financing. Our positions around money in politics were developed after the Watergate era. After Watergate. So they're from the 1970s. Right now, a new study is underway that's just getting off the ground at the LWV US level to address some of the implications of court decisions at the federal level in the last few years. So for instance, the new study will consider what would it mean to try to amend our Constitution with regard to money in politics? Or what other types of reforms and positions can we support right at the present time, even in the absence of a constitutional amendment? And the League itself is an ongoing supporter for improved federal legislation right now, and that includes some of the types of improvements that I'll talk about today. I think there's a lot of confusion about how money in politics works. So I'd like to start out today with just a basic primer. In Minnesota, the Minnesota League did a report called The Tip of the Iceberg and that was published in December of 2013. And so a lot of the materials about the primer that I'm going to use are from that. So in case you want to check back, this report is on our website, and it's also referenced on the handout, on the back of the handout that you have today. So with regard to financing an election in Minnesota, first the candidate, him or herself, will set up a campaign fund, solicit contributions, and make expenditures in favor of her election. Minnesota sets limits on contributions to a candidate's campaign fund by political action committees, political parties, and individuals. And corporations are prohibited from directly contributing to a candidate's campaign fund. The candidate may also seek public financing. In this case, the candidate must meet such strict requirements, such as showing they're a viable candidate by raising a certain money to support their campaign and also making a strong showing in a primary. And if they do seek partial public funding, they agree to a spending limit. They may receive up to half of the designated spending limit from public funding. A third category of spending that influences elections here and all around the United States is independent spending. These are expenditures made by groups independent of the candidate, and the candidate has no input or ability to affect an independent spender's message. So these might be political action committees, labor unions, political parties, or something, a kind of a catch-all for others called independent expenditure committees. And any one of us could set up an independent spending committee. I was listening to NPR about a month ago, and I heard a junior in high school in Minnetonka talking about how he had done a project on independent spending and campaign finance in Minnesota, and in the course of that project, he had set up his own political action committee. I imagine it's not well funded, but if you could set it up, and then you can try to get the money to make a difference with what you do with it. So just basically, their financing comes through the candidate's own committee, where there's control of the message, and then a lot of the spending comes through independent spenders. And this is a category that's really exploded since Citizens United. Prior to the Citizens United decision, corporations in Minnesota could contribute only to ballot question committees. That would be, for instance, the type of ballot questions we saw on the ballot in 2012 around marriage and elections and photo ID. But with respect to Citizens United, the court held that under the First Amendment, corporations and political unions have the same political speech rights as individuals, and they can use their money to make election-related expenditures on advertisements, flyers, and other ways that they can influence the election of a candidate. This graph shows the impact of the Citizens United decision in Minnesota in 2010 and 2012. The red column is the column that we didn't see before Citizens United. It's really high in 2010 because that was the year of the gubernatorial election. And in Minnesota, you generally see a higher influence, more independent spending when there's that kind of statewide election. It dropped off some in 2012 to about $4.5 million, but that was $4.5 million that wasn't there before. And I'd like to just talk a little bit about the fact that this $4.5 million and this almost $9 million that we're seeing the prior 2 years, they're only the tip of the iceberg, because not all independent spending in Minnesota has to be disclosed. And that's one of the things that we're trying to change, and some other advocates are trying to change in state law. This ad, if it was put out to the community, and this in fact was, is a regulated ad. The person, the corporation, not corporation, but independent spender behind this ad would need to disclose that, who they are and what they spent, to the Minnesota Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board. This ad would not have to be disclosed. And first every ad that I'm showing here is perfectly legal. I'm not criticizing any of the candidates or the people behind them. They're perfectly legal under our law. But what's the difference? The difference is that this ad does not use one of the magic words of advocacy. Vote for, vote against, elect, defeat. The same with this ad. This is a screenshot from an advertisement that was on TV before the 2010 election. Here again, this ad is a screenshot from a TV advertisement prior to the I'm not sure if it was 2010 or 2012. But these don't have to be disclosed because they don't use these magic words. 25 other states and the federal government would require disclosure of these types of ads if they were used in proximity to an election, 60 days before a general election. But Minnesota does not. And generally, the ads that we tend to get really sick of on TV, the negative ads, they're by the independent spenders. The candidates are far less likely to use that type of advertising. A watchdog group has actually given the state of Minnesota an F because our campaign finance laws do not require disclosure of these types of communications. So as a first step, we would like to see Minnesota close the loophole and require disclosure of electioneering communications. They're called electioneering communications. I don't know if I made that clear. They're sometimes called sham issue ads also. They purport to be about an issue, but the focus is really to elect or defeat a candidate. So that's our first recommendation. Our second recommendation is to improve the Minnesota Campaign Finance website. First, I want to say that the Minnesota Campaign Finance Disclosure Board is an excellent agency in Minnesota. It's a very small staff. I think right now it's 9 people, and they are responsible for a whole panoply of elections and campaign reports, and they have a very, I think they work very hard and they're good advocates for disclosure. But their budget has not permitted them to maintain a very good website. The information might be there somewhere, but it's very hard to find. This is a snapshot of the Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board website. I testified at a hearing last December at the Capitol, and this is such an excellent audience to ask this question of. One of the legislators, after I talked about we need to improve this website to make it more accessible to citizens, he said to me, well, aren't League of Women Voters people who can utilize that website? So just raise your hand if you've ever tried to go into that website and actually found the information you were looking for. 1, 2.
I've been there, but I couldn't find what I was looking for.
Okay, we've got 2 people who said they were there and found the information. We've got 1 person who said she was there and couldn't find it. I find the website extremely challenging. I've had college students as interns who have dug and been very challenged by finding information. So we are supporting an improvement of the website, and I am happy to say that it is happening. Right now, the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board is soliciting public comment on how to improve the website. So yay, we are moving ahead on that. Here's a snapshot of the Washington website, which is very user-friendly, partly because it contains user guides for how you utilize the database, and partly because of the layout. It helps you find the information and sort through with direction. You know where to go. Our third recommendation relates to the U.S. Supreme Court decisions in McCutcheon versus the Federal Election Committee, which was decided last week. Or no, I'm sorry. When I made these notes, had been decided a week before. Now it's a few months. The Supreme Court struck down overall campaign contribution limits that prevented individuals from contributing more than $123,000 to candidates and committees per election cycle. The LWV-US had filed an amicus brief in support of retaining the limits. And the court found that although there was some rationale to have limits on what you gave to one particular candidate, there was no reasonable rationale for putting limits on what you gave out generally to multiple candidates. And really behind all the federal court rulings that have come out recently is a case called, the seminal case in campaign finance law in the US Supreme Court is Buckley versus Vallejo, decided in the 1970s. And what that case really decided was that money was the equivalent of speech, in that you can't really communicate without some money behind you to make it happen. So I think, well, there may be some rationale for that. Things have gotten really out of hand. So the LWVUS, after the McCutcheon decision, said, this is another loophole allowing our political parties to be further corrupted by big money contributions from special interests. Big money is worth more than the voices of individual citizens. LWVUS and the Minnesota League support as one solution a small donor empowerment model. A small donor empowerment model would be a system where if a small donor made a contribution, it would be multiplied by some level with public funding. So for instance, if we had a 5-to-1 public matching program in Minnesota, and I wanted to support a candidate in my district, I could give $50 to that candidate, and that candidate would get a 5-to-1 match. So they'd get $300 or $250 more from my contribution. The reason that this is helpful, first of all, it just multiplies the impact of the small donor. When you give a small donation, it has a much bigger impact on the candidate's money box. But it also has a really big impact on candidates. If a candidate can, I heard on the radio a couple weeks ago that federal candidates spend about 70% of their time raising money. So if you're running for office and you're holding a seat in US Congress, you can see where a lot of your time is spent. And the small donor empowerment models allow a candidate to feel encouraged to go out and spend time with small donors because they know that the small donations will be multiplied. So if a candidate has a choice of going one evening to an event where they're going to be with major big money special interests, or if they can instead go down to their a grassroots meeting in their district, you can see that the small donor empowerment model makes it much more worthwhile for them. And it also gives them a chance to listen to the constituents. So we're supporting that. There has not been any legislation to put that through in Minnesota right now, but in the long term, we're supporting it as a longer-term solution that we should begin working on now. As the last slide showed, I guess I skipped this, we do have partial public financing in Minnesota, as I described earlier. And the money for that comes from a legislative appropriation from the general fund and tax form checkoffs. We also have the Minnesota Political Contribution Refund Program, where if, as an individual, you give $50, you can get that $50 back from a public fund. You have to make an application to do that. And these are great programs, and they really do have made a difference in helping small donors to have a stronger voice in Minnesota. But as I said, they're only partial. They only fund up to 50% of the candidate's program. And also, some of our candidates elect not to utilize it. Dayton in 2010 and Palante in 2006 both declined to use public financing, so they were not subject to spending limits. And we saw earlier that that number really went up in 2010 on independent spending. And so there's more special interest money coming in. So the three suggestions that Minnesota League is making for reform right now is to require disclosure of electioneering communications, close the loophole and require disclosure of sham issue ads, improve the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board website so the disclosure laws that we have and may enact really do provide access to the public. The United States Supreme Court, despite its rulings recently that have restricted campaign finance laws, repeatedly in each opinion stresses that disclosure remains and is as a viable thing to do under the First Amendment and, in fact, should be done. The last Supreme Court decision, I believe it was McCutcheon, said really supported using the internet specifically as a means of ways for people to get access that they could not have had in the past about independent spending. And third, we want to promote the small donor empowerment model. This model has been has been adopted in some municipalities around the country. No state has yet adopted it. There was an effort to get it through in the New York legislature early in 2014. It was not successful. But in the long run, we believe that encouraging small donors is the most effective way to combat contribution and undue influence. Allow the candidates to compete more equitably for office and allow maximum participation in the public financing process. Okay, now we're getting to the more fun part of the presentation. So, who is our greatest enemy right now in the fight against money in politics? I don't think it's special interests and the big money themselves. It's apathy and cynicism. Well, there's might be some call to name other guilty parties, but We can't immediately change the Supreme Court law or holdings that have been made. They're gonna be around for a while. But where is the outrage about what is happening to our democracy? We've become relatively complacent about big money. And I understand that partly because it seems hard to find ways to fight back. But I do think that we're really early in the process. A lot of these things have happened. Citizens United was decided in 2010. So we're a little more than 4 years out on that. McCutcheon, a few months ago. People are working and trying to figure out what are the answers. And there's a variety of answers that are being offered. Some of you may have seen the motion to amend campaign, supporting a constitutional amendment saying that corporations are not people. Things like the League is suggesting, additional disclosure, small donor financing. There's federal legislation aimed at super PACs as opposed to PACs, and trying to put limits on how money can be moved around and used. But I think it's encouraging. I think it's encouraging that all these different solutions are being offered, and there's discussion about how are we going to do it. The first thing I'd like to encourage you to do is educate yourselves and others. This is a slide of Trevor Potter, who was on the Stephen Colbert Show on Comedy Central for a series of about 5 or 6 programs in which Trevor Potter, who is a national expert on campaign finance and worked for some of the Republican campaigns, spoke about special interest spending in Minnesota and engaged with Stephen Colbert around what could be done. Now, Stephen Colbert, of course, is a comedy show. And it's a lot of us don't go to it for news, but actually one of the major United States newspapers, I think it was the Washington Post, explored ways to educate the public about campaign finance, and they said this series on the Colbert Show was one of the most effective ways that people were able to understand money in politics.
You were referring earlier to that 70% of the time that Congress people spend on how they spend their time is on campaign finance and raising money. And if there wasn't a 2-year cycle, then they would perhaps spend less. I wonder if the figure, if you were to break up the United States Senate versus the House of Representatives, if those figures would be more useful to see how they might differ from one to the other. And then the same thing in our state capital, because if you're not constantly running for office, you're not constantly having to raise the money.
So I believe everyone heard that because we had a microphone for that. So there certainly are suggestions to change the period of time that some of our elected officials are in office. I think the 2 years in Minnesota for our House is particularly difficult. The federal Congress is 4 years. So I agree with you that, sorry, 2, you're right, okay. Okay, 2 and 6. So I agree with you. That is a big factor in how people have to constantly raise money, and it also, I think, affects when you work up at the Capitol trying to pass legislation. I think there's a real change in the second year around how much you can engage with the legislators and how much their attention has turned to the election rather than what's going on. So that's an excellent suggestion. So the first thing, educate ourselves about that and other things. Second, I'd like to urge you to support Minnesota's partial public financing that exists right now. First of all, I don't know how many of you have seen the tax form checkoff on your Minnesota individual tax returns. And if you check that box saying you want money to $5 to go to the Minnesota candidate fund, you're not lessening your refund. You're actually telling the legislature to take $5 out of the general fund and use it, or from the general fund and use it for campaigns. So the more of us do that, the more money gets shifted to public financing. If you have and some people might say, well, why does the public have to finance elections? Well, if we don't, who does? Someone has to finance campaigns. It's not like raising money for campaign. Candidates have to do it. I mean, they need to raise money to have offices and phone systems and put out flyers and, depending what office you're running for, radio and TV ads. So it does cost money. And if we want to see our elected leaders represent the public interest, that public funding makes a difference in that. And the political contribution refund program was in abeyance for a few years after it, I think it was Governor Pawlenty stopped it because of budget deficits in Minnesota, but it's back in force and it's very underutilized. So if in your own life you may use it, but please also tell your friends, tell your family. It's a real strong way to boost our public financing in Minnesota. Another thing I want you to do is start a tsunami. Can I take questions later? Okay, thanks. If one of your legislators got 5 citizens to contact them about campaign finance in Minnesota, it would be a tsunami. If they get 300 contacts about gun regulation, yeah, that's kind of, okay, we expect that. Nobody is talking to their legislators about and asking for public finance reform. The League met with a couple leaders in the House after the conclusion of the 2010 session, or 2014 session, because in 2013 and 14 there was legislation pending in the House to close this loophole in electioneering communications and the one around sham issue ads. And it didn't pass either year. And one of the legislative leaders said, our legislators have to hear from their constituents on this. There was a lot of support for the legislation, but shortly before the issue and the bill would have reached the floor in 2014, 2 very prominent special interest groups in Minnesota came out against the bill and said they were going to score legislators' votes on the bill. And some organizations have legislative scorecards. And it's where they pick out certain issues that they're going to track. How do legislators vote at the Capitol? And at the end of the session, they tally it and they share that with their members and the public and say, this legislator got an A because on our 8 priority items, he voted in favor of us every time. This legislator got an F because on our 8 priority items, she voted against us every time. These groups, what they're doing is completely legitimate. But the thing that really bothers me is that special interest groups were able to stop a bill which would have required disclosure of special interest spending. And, those scorecards talk to some of our legislators, particularly those in swing districts, when they have to make a decision which way to vote on something. So it really matters that they hear from us. And I just urge you not to feel you have to be an expert on money in politics and campaign finance to share your views with your legislator. Because it's a very complex and data-ridden field, but you don't have to know all the details. It's enough to be able to make your point and give some basic points about your concerns. And the League also, we send out to our members action alerts during the session. So, for instance, if you're a League member, next session, if this disclosure bill is pending again, you can sign up to get our action alerts, and we'll tell you, HF House File 2013 is going to committee, and we need our legislators to hear from their constituents. Please contact them. And that makes a real difference when it's an issue that the legislators aren't hearing from their constituents about very often. Another idea that we are asking, particularly our League members to do at candidate forums and other opportunities, is ask the candidates, who are the major funders of your campaign? Who are the major funders of the independent spenders? Who are the major independent spenders who are supporting your election? I mean, it's not to say they're bad people because they get that money, but it allows us to evaluate the views of our candidates and how they might vote when they're elected to office. I always like to tell this story of my son. He's a junior at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And the first year that he went to college, this issue came up about his friends and going to do this activity that he knew that we wouldn't approve of. And he told us about it, and he was invited to go along. And I said, and so why did you decide not to do it? Expecting, like some great answer about his moral background. And instead he said, because you're paying my tuition. He didn't want us to find out what he did because we might withdraw the money. And I just feel that's a perfect example of how big spenders influence our legislators. You don't have to say, it's not a quid pro quo even that I had to make with my son. I didn't have to have a contract, or I didn't have to hand him a briefcase full of money to take to school if he did a certain thing. I mean, it's more subtle these days. It's money moving behind the scenes, money passing from contributor to PAC, but I think the candidates, for the most part, very well know who's contributing, and they very well know that when they take votes if they're elected.
So that doesn't have to be disclosed now? They don't have to write down where they have it from?
A question was asked, so they don't have to disclose now where they're getting money from. Well, certainly some of their contributors would have to be disclosed. But the reason larger contributors, but the reason I'm making that point is that I think it ought to be more public. Why don't we put that out in public dialogue? Right now, we'll probably have to go through that Campaign Finance Board website to find out who the contributors are. I think we should have more open discussions about it in public settings. It shouldn't be a secret. So in the end, I want to give you a message of that, we can make change. We have had huge problems in this country that have been solved. Look at the civil rights era, how long it takes, what effort and how long it took to make those changes, but it was done. And this is another opportunity that we have as citizens to express our voice, to make clear to our candidates and our elected leaders what our views are, and to work for change. It's not going to happen overnight. But what we do makes a difference. And I hope that you'll help us and engage in this effort. So thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Yes, I have a comment on the CF board website.
Uh-huh.
I have probably made a dozen trips up there in the last 2 years looking for information. And, you know, it is hard to find things on their website. I did find it, but I had to look hard. My real problem is the best information is not on the website. It's in those file cabinets when you come in the room.
Yeah.
And so that stuff needs to be rolling. We should be able to access it from any place in the state, and it's inhibiting people that don't live within a reasonable distance of the CF board to go and get that information. So that's my comments. We really need to get everything that's there viewable by the public. I have some concerns with the basic lobbying process and nonprofit lobbies who are now running and controlling the floors of our legislature. And the average person just simply does not know what is going on. You look at what happened at the end of this session with the Data Practices Act and the health plans exempting themselves, so all their data is trade secret. That effort was perhaps the biggest lobbying effort ever seen in St. Paul, even bigger than that for the Viking Stadium. And these are all nonprofit entities that are not being watched. They're already under federal investigation. They're just not being watched. They have way too much influence. Thank you.
I agree with that comment. The ability of C4s, which are a certain entity of nonprofits that can do extensive lobbying to affect the process and use a lot of money and influence to do so, is very significant. And also with respect to the Campaign Finance Board website, there was an investigation by the Star Tribune last fall that resulted in it coming to light that some records on the Campaign Finance Board website were not accurate. And I also have been in that office and seen the files that are very dense and only in that office. So I think as part of the Campaign Finance Board website improvement, it's not just how the website looks, but it's how data will come to, and I don't pretend to be a tech expert, but you know, it would be best for all data to come to the Campaign Finance Board website electronically rather than on paper, and that would help them be able to make it more available more quickly, and that be the source rather than paper filings.
I don't know much about the history. I'm fairly new to Minnesota politics, but when I was first out of school, I worked in the United States Senate, and campaign finance was one of the top 3 issues throughout the years I worked there, and it remained so. So laws would get passed, and then people would find a way to circumvent them. So then laws would get passed again, and people would find ways to circumvent them. And so it's still an ongoing issue, which is why it feels a little bit like the hamster on the wheel, and you're always chasing it. And you're trying to do this thing here, and this little piece here, and this little piece here. But you know, really the larger problem is that they're forced to run for office so frequently, and that would get the hamster off the wheel, at least, you know, with the frequency that it's doing so now. So why isn't there a larger agenda looked at, the big picture, instead of the hamster on the wheel, and let's try and plug this and plug this and plug this, because the special interests are motivated enough that they'll find, oh, you know, a way around this and a way around that. So has that been the history in the state of Minnesota, or has campaign finance just come up recently, or is, I assume it would be mirroring what was happening in our United States Senate and House?
Well, I think to some extent, Minnesota, I think Minnesota has had pretty good campaign finance laws compared to the rest of the country, in part because of our partial public financing, which nationally is viewed as a good model. And it has encouraged small donors more so than in other states. But that's just one place where we've done well. We haven't done particularly well on keeping up with the changes in independent spending and closing the loophole. And like most states, we face problems with how federal law allows C4s, nonprofits that can do a lot of lobbying, to utilize their money here. When Trevor Potter, who I mentioned was on the Stephen Colbert show, spoke, he came to Minnesota in February, and there was a program at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs on public finance, and he was asked the question that you asked. If we enact one law, aren't special interests going to find a way to get around that and do something else? And his answer was basically, this is an ongoing process. We have to be constantly looking at this issue, and I don't think that's really been true. I mean, we had this big changes in law in the 70s and more campaign finance regulation, but since then, we've become more complacent, I think, until this recent round of federal court decisions has really affected the public dialogue more so, and allowed more spending. So, I mean, his answer and mine, and it's not very satisfying, is that you don't stop trying to improve it because someone might try to get around what you do.
But you might go for the larger issue.
You're right.
But you might go for the larger issue that would render all these little things moot.
And what would render everything moot?
Well, it would render it, if we had longer periods with which people were in office, it would happen less frequently that these issues would be relevant. It would not that would not make them moot, but it wouldn't make them so pressing and so consistent with a 2-year cycle.
Well, that's a good point. And actually, in next year, in the fall, the league is beginning plans right now to put on have a public forum about representation and address some of these broader questions. And we hope to bring in people who can talk about it from the larger system standpoint. Redistricting, for instance, is something that we have failed on reform in Minnesota. And so that would be part of the dialogue, but also things like length of service, also things like what other models exist. I mean, there's places in the world that elect more than one candidate for a district, and or places that have requirements for certain levels of, you need this people from this ethnic group or this gender to be more representative of the population in the district. So those are definitely really important questions, and I'm really glad you raised them. I don't think there's any quick solutions, but you're absolutely right that it's more, part of this is a systemic, institutionalized issue that doesn't just need picking at, but needs a broader search.
based on the Supreme Court decisions, how far can we push the disclosure idea? It's one thing if independent spenders have to, at the end of their ad, say, and this was paid for by the people for the American way. You know, you look at it and you go, okay. You have really no idea who is behind that. Can we take legislation far enough that Alliance for Better Minnesota, People for the American Way, whatever they call themselves, that on that campaign finance website, we would know who the people were behind that organization? Can we ask for a set of board of directors? Can we ask for anybody who gives more than $100 to that organization that their name would have to be public? How far can we push that disclosure piece so that we really know who's doing what?
I think the disclosure piece can be pushed. The bill that we supported in the last session to close the election loophole on electioneering communications, I think actually the reason the special interest groups were so strong in opposing it was that part of the bill was that they had to disclose their major contributors. For instance, C4, a nonprofit that does a lot of lobbying, under that bill, if it was making electioneering communications, would have to disclose its contributors of $1,000 or more. And that, I think, is the reason they opposed the bill. Because they were able to, people, they didn't want to let the public know. And I think that's really wrong because in a democracy, the central tenet is with free speech, we are identified. I don't think our founding fathers imagined a system where we could speak without knowing who was speaking. And just in our everyday lives, we evaluate what we hear based on who the speaker is. And we're being deprived of that opportunity. And if a person doesn't want to make a contribution of $1,000 or more because their name would be disclosed, that's their choice.
Hi. I don't understand why in a local election you can only give $600 and you can give unlimited money. Is that a state thing as opposed to federal?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Are there limits in local elections anymore? Is that like an old thing? No, they're still there. Well, why are they there if you can give as much money as you want? If people can give $1 million, I don't understand what's going on. I don't get it. I know there's local limits. It's on the website. It's on the state website.
That's something I haven't explored since the McCutcheon decision. Exactly. I don't think that there was one part of Minnesota law that was challenged right after McCutcheon, but it wasn't that. It was, and so I really can't answer that question. I think it deserves exploration.
I'm kind of outside the box here. Let me give you a little different perspective on the chipmunk running or whatever he's in the wheel. We have a lot of things going on right now about voter registration. That we got the wrong people voting and so on. What I'd like to see them think about is that if you cannot vote in a district, why should you be electing or selecting the candidates? It's very easy that the way things are going, that somebody in New York and billionaires in Texas and so on like that can give me the two candidates that I can vote for. But they can't vote in my election. So it seems like, we're getting the wrong people selecting the candidates by the way the money flows. And it was like when you had originally up there about it's for sale, democracy for sale. Democracy is paid for when the candidates are selected, and I think Wisconsin was in the news a lot because the last election, that's what they did basically. The Koch brothers Foundation was supporting all the candidates in all the elections and stuff like that. And but the Koch brothers can't vote in Wisconsin. So I think that we got to look at it that way and make an uproar and get that kind of a thing going. Why should the people be someplace? I get all kinds of letters from every senatorial district in the United States, all of them there now, giving me emails and letters wanting donations for that. And I'm saying, why should I be supporting somebody in Kentucky on either party?
Well, that's a really good comment. Money is moved around. I don't know, I just imagine like this map of the United States, and there's this ether above us where political money is moved from state to state. And that, I don't have an answer to solving that, but I think it needs to be part of the dialogue. That right.
Brought forth that this is an area that all of us can look at, and I think if we can stir this up in the conversation somehow, if we can get some traction, it's not going to get traction. The big money's not going to want it, right, obviously, and so it's going to have to be the other factors that will bring it there and bring it to the attention of people that this is what's happening. Somebody in other states very, very well selecting who the candidates you're voting for.
Right. I think it should be part of what we talk about when we talk about the money in politics problem, that we talk about that element.
Of course, an answer to that is that someone in another state really affects us, and their vote would affect us. The Southern people who are voting against birth control, that affects us. So we should have a say in that, I think, if money is speech, if that's the way we do it.
I'd only comment that I don't think our system is really organized that way. It's true that what happens in other states affects us, but we do have, our elected leaders are responsible to their constituents primarily.
Just a comment on the last two pieces of input, and that the whole idea of outside money. I think when you're talking, and maybe a law could be written like this, I don't know how you'd enforce it, that you can't donate like to a school board election. There are national groups now who are backing school board candidates, which seems to me absolutely ludicrous, going along with the gentleman in the back there. And yet, the comment next to me that when you look at the balance of power in the United States Senate or the United States House of Representatives, where Minnesota doesn't get as many representatives as other places do, and so those national laws are going to affect us, and thus we and other larger organizations might want to donate to those campaigns. I don't know whether you could sort of level that money, in other words, that for what are essentially national offices, soliciting money on a national basis might not be so outlandish, even though we might not like it all that much. But that, when you're making laws for Minnesota or for Edina Public Schools, and you're taking money from the Koch brothers Foundation, that's a little scary. I can't give attribution for this because my husband heard it on the radio yesterday, but it is a mantra that I had not heard before that is very interesting. When money is speech, speech is no longer free.
So maybe that should be one of my slides. Well, I think one of the things these comments illustrates is just really these are, relatively complicated issues in terms of representation, in terms of who our elected leaders represent, and the voice of citizens and how big money is affecting it. So I really encourage you to talk about these issues in your community, and if you're not a league member, join the league. We really focus on those issues on a consistent basis. I just want to wind up with a couple other pieces of information, a little bit outside of campaign finance, is Minnesota's absentee voting period opened yesterday. We have a new law in Minnesota that you don't need an excuse to vote absentee. That's going into effect. That's in effect right now. So any of you who just want to vote ahead of time, or if you think you don't know if you'd have a conflict on election day, you can go into an elections office and get an absentee ballot application, or we have a new system of online applications for absentee ballots. Also, many of you know there's now online voter registration, which is a real asset in our state and helps people who move or people who are new voters to register easily. And finally, I just want to make a pitch for the Secretary of State is a really important office in Minnesota. I was asked a couple weeks ago, how does it vary from the U.S. Secretary of State, which I thought was a really good question that had never occurred to me before. So the Minnesota Secretary of State handles business filings and helps, is part of getting businesses off the ground here in Minnesota. But for our purposes here today, it is also the head of the Minnesota election system. So it's really key to maintaining election integrity and also to providing access to all eligible voters to the ballot box. So the League of Women Voters is hosting a candidate forum for the Secretary of State's office on Tuesday, October 28th at Augsburg College at 7 p.m. And it's also going to be live streamed on a news media service called The Uptake, which you could find by Googling. And so I really invite you all to watch that either live or on The Uptake and really so you can make a real informed decision about what's at stake in terms of who we elect as Secretary of State. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Sherry.